Welcome to Salmon Wars, the podcast where we dive deep into the challenges facing the iconic salmon of the Pacific Northwest. I'm your host, Cody McLaughlin, a passionate salmon fisherman in the last frontier of Alaska. Join me as I interview a wide range of experts, including biologists, commercial and recreational fishermen, advocates, native people, politicians, and other stakeholders. Together, we'll explore the driving forces behind the dramatic decline in salmon returns and seek solutions to save these vital fish populations before it's too late. This limited-run investigative series will take you on a journey through the complex world of salmon conservation and management. Subscribe now to join the fight to protect our salmon and preserve the rich ecosystems they support. Together, we can make a difference in the future of these magnificent fish. Welcome to Salmon Wars. Jon Warrenchuk from Oceana, thank you so much for joining the Salmon Wars podcast. It's great to have you on, man.
Great, thanks. Thanks. Glad to be here.
Well, so for our listeners who are tuning in, this is episode 1 of the Salmon Wars podcast. It's not the first one we've recorded, but it is the first one that you will see in your feed, and there is a big reason for that. That is because Mr. Warrenchuk here is a fisheries biologist and just an expert in the field of salmon and what's happening specifically regarding our content matter. So the reason we're having Jon on today is to talk about the science behind, what's going on with salmon, what's going on with creating salmon stocks, to kind of answer the question that I'm going to be asking all the guests, which is there a salmon problem according to the science? And then dive into that science to give you the opportunity to start from a scientific background before you hear all the perspectives of the different people who are affected by what's going on with salmon in the Pacific Northwest. So this is going to be a great episode. Really looking forward to it. Jon, take a few moments. Tell us about your laurels. Really tell us about, your career. How did you become a fisheries biologist? That was something I wanted to do when I was younger. I just never went through with it. Now I'm just a podcast guy, but tell us about yourself.
Wow, Cody, great introduction. Thanks. Thanks for having me on. Well, hey, I'm joining you today. I'm here in Juneau, Alaska. It's kind of a, typical spring day. We're counting down the days till the Chinook season opens here for us. I think June 1st, maybe, for the terminal harvest. Boy, I came up to Alaska almost 25 years ago. I came up for grad school in fisheries itself, actually, at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, our fisheries school based in Juneau. It was a great experience. I was out, actually, let me back up a minute. It was a experience. My thesis, my master's thesis, my graduate studies were on Bering Sea snow crab. The deadliest catch, of course, everyone knows. I went out on one of those boats. Before that reality series even started, it was actually the last year of the Derby fishery before it went to what they call a catch share program. And actually the first year they filmed Deadliest Catch.
Wow.
So I went out to collect samples of crabs to do an estimate of what the mortality of the bycatch of the crabs were the smaller crabs that the commercial fishermen would throw back back into the Bering Sea after catching them. And I'll tell you, Cody and your listeners, you got to have great respect for fishermen who venture out into the Bering Sea in February, because that is an environment that is completely insane. I mean, it's just like you see on that TV show. It's 30-foot seas. It's ice on the boats. It's a hard, crazy, dangerous job. So I learned that being that far out at sea studying crab was probably not going to be my gig. And even though it was a great, interesting thing to study, I still love actually studying crab. Since then, I got to do a lot of interesting deep sea work, actually studying animals that live on the seafloor.
Yes.
Things that the crabs eat, deep sea corals, their habitat. And that's when I really started getting interested in the role of the habitat itself on the productivity of the ecosystem, and specifically the North Pacific ecosystem and all these other all these fish species and crab species that we care about that provide some economy and are very tasty. I mean, we have, you
That's
know,
right.
up here in Alaska, when there is abundance and when there is enough, this is some of the most healthiest, best proteins in the world to eat. And you wish almost everyone on the planet could have an opportunity to eat this kind of food, but unfortunately, that isn't the case and can't be the case. Alaska can't feed the whole planet. And that's primarily what my role is here at Oceana, is to recognize the role
Yes.
of fisheries as a source of food, but balance that and manage it accordingly based on sustainability um, and long-term health of the ecosystem. Because the impacts of fisheries, if not taken into account, can really, first of all, have a large impact on the fish or animals that they're targeting themselves, and also, if you're not careful, could screw up their very habitat that they need to grow and provide you opportunities to catch them. So that's how I got into uh, looking at the weird squishy creatures that live on the seafloor and in the muds that are sometimes out of sight and out of mind until you bring them to the attention of the public. And boy, the more you study, the more you learn about uh, the Alaska ecosystem, what's down in some of our deep cold waters. You'd be astounded at the biodiversity and wealth of just life that's down there, but life that's also at risk from damaging development practices, which in Alaska, offshore at sea, includes what we call industrial trawling.
Hey, thanks for that, John. So I think there's a great segue into what we're here to talk about today. So a lot of stuff that you said, I want to touch on. There's so many things. The first thing I want to talk through is this notion of like the interdependence of all of the ocean's biomass, if you will. And forgive me if I'm butchering any terms, but what happens when a species or group of species gets overfished or overharvested because they might be bycatch or something of that nature? What are some of the effects that not just the ocean habitat, but what are some of the effects inland, if especially if the fish are anadromous, like migratory species like salmon or others? What are some of the effects that that has?
Well, yeah, let's talk about Chinook salmon. I mean, Chinook salmon has been king salmon. The plight of king salmon has been on everyone's minds here in Alaska.
It is.
It's certainly, you know, everyone everyone's, if it's not the favorite, at least their top two sport fish to be catching here in Alaska, or food fish.
They don't
You know,
call
they,
him the king for nothing.
they don't call them the king for nothing. At the same time, these are the largest, longest lived, and they've always been the least abundant of all the salmon species.
Eh,
And admittedly, over the last 100 years, we've managed Chinook salmon overall in kind of a poorly conceived experiment in many ways.
it
We've
is.
seen and we've learned, and we're still kind of paying the price for many mistakes from the past. uh, you remember, you've heard about, or any of your listeners haven't heard about, the Columbia River down off of Washington used to
I used to
have,
live down in Oregon, like
well,
behind it.
right, Oregon, Washington, Pacific
Yeah.
Northwest. They had the legendary June hogs, which were
Yes.
Chinook that reached over 80 pounds, and those were basically extinguished, extirpated, made extinct by damming their habitat.
Mhm.
And despite hundreds of millions and billions of dollars actually trying to recover some of those salmon populations or mitigate through hatcheries and fish ladders, you've lost those genes and that stock and that wild capacity for salmon to grow that big anymore in that region.
Let me interject with a question here for a second. When you say lost, help us understand the gravity of that situation, right? So obviously the genes are lost, because those salmon are dead and they didn't get a chance to reproduce, right? Like that's the core of it. But when we say lost, help people understand why isn't it that every king salmon could be 100 pounds if it just lived long enough? Like help people understand that, for instance, a lot of the what we call a jack king in Alaska, the smaller sized slot fish that come swimming up the rivers, they're not really ready to breed, as I understand it, right? Help us understand the science behind that.
Sure. Well, actually, let me just quickly talk about jacks. From what I know, jacks can sometimes they can breathe. They
Oh,
sneak
okay.
in there. That's how they. They're not big enough to uh, outcompete a larger spawning Chinook, but they are
Mhm.
earlier. And if they're there when a female's there, sure they'll go for it. Um, but that not every one of them's sexually mature yet, but many of them are, and they can. And that's kind of an example of what they call. Well, I don't know about jacks themselves, but they have observed patterns in salmon overall that they're smaller at age than they used to be. I'll
Mm.
come back to that, but let's talk about your first question was about salmon genetics, which is a fascinating topic. There's been quite a bit of interesting research on the genetics of salmon, just because there's such a range of life history and
Mhm.
diversity uh, within salmon as a species. So if you take
Sure.
like Chinook salmon, here's one of the characteristics of Chinook that I hope would give them a little bit of resilience to natural impacts, because they're very what's called plastic. They've evolved to spawn in the winter, in the fall, or in the spring, depending on stock, right? So the species itself has the capacity to spawn in all kinds of rivers and all kinds of conditions. Um,
Mhm.
and so those genes that help them do that, uh, you need that kind of diverse sets of habitats that are productive for those genes to flow back into the populations, right? And then um, salmon can wander into other streams. They call it I forgot what the term is, but they might spawn. They might not return to their natal streams. They might wander and spawn in a stream nearby, and that's
Mm.
kind of how you get a lot of gene exchange and maintain diversity. Um, and so yeah, that's um, an important thing to remember when you're talking about conserving salmon stocks, because I believe, in North America, there's been around 50 stocks of salmon that they would call extinct now.
Wow.
Yeah,
That
which have
many,
gone
huh?
extinct. Yeah, yeah,
And
and
that
many of
is
these,
that including or not including the Atlantic salmon on the East Coast?
you know what? Was I including that? But that is a good example of we sure learned what not to do there on the Atlantic side. I mean
Well,
that
did we learn? I mean, that's the whole point of this podcast is to
right,
figure out whether we actually learned anything from that,
right,
right?
right. So let's back up a step where Alaska in general has been lauded on their sustainable and sensible management practices, managing for escapement, making sure a certain number of fish have gotten up the stream before you open fisheries. And that has generally worked fairly well. Although escapement goals themselves, there may or may not be well estimated. And you really, um, there's probably only a small percentage of those escapement goals that have some solid um, estimates or science behind them to say, hey, this is the kind of number you really need up there. Because most of them are either based on historical observations or on
Mhm.
past catch needs or something like that. But in general, overall, it's worked okay.
Mhm.
But now, on the other hand, so even if if you could manage everything that happens to salmon once it hits the river, you gotta also worry about, okay, how do we help salmon survive these gauntlet of pressures throughout their whole life history.
Yeah, because they don't spend their whole life in the river, that's for
Right.
sure.
Yeah. They salmon is or Chinook, as we know, well, at least in Alaska and the Pacific Northwest, they divide them up by stream type and ocean type. Stream type, once they hatch from eggs, they may spend more than 1 year in the river in the freshwater, and then the ocean type, they
Yes.
may migrate out prior to 1 year. So your stream types, they can be up to 2 years old. They get a little bigger. They have a little, they're a little better at being predators. They're eating a lot of fish
Yes.
and bugs in the rivers, getting bigger, stronger. Then they migrate out. Having said that, we need more studies to do some out migration tagging and learn a little more about the fate of those salmon. That's a little bit of a research and data gap in Alaska.
All right, so let me back up for a second because we skipped over my first question because I wanted to get right into the science with you, and I may even have to insert this like at the beginning of the episode. So there's one overarching question that I'm asking all the guests, and I'm more interested to hear what you have to say about it than almost any other guest. No offense to all my wonderful guests, you guys are great. But is there a salmon problem, not just in Alaska, but like in the Pacific Northwest?
Oh yeah, there's a salmon crisis, a Chinook salmon crisis. Uh, you know, the Chinook salmon have always been our largest and rarest of the salmon, and they're only getting
Mm.
rarer and smaller. Um, and why is that? Well, we're seeing a contraction of their range from many of their uh, habitats that were in the Pacific Northwest. Um, they're not making it up into their longest, most major river drainage rearing systems. So, the unique
Yes.
genes that allow Yukon River salmon to migrate up to 2,000 miles up the Yukon. There's just not enough of
Wow.
those salmon getting up there to reproduce and flow back down the river and have those. You got to think that a salmon that's grows big enough, strong enough, maintains enough fat reserves to power itself all the way up the Yukon River. You got to think that that salmon at sea has got to be a pretty good escape artist, avoiding predation, and that whole deal. Now, um, let's talk about at river survival. So that's the big, or not at river, at sea survival. So what
Yeah.
happens to the salmon when they're out at sea? Well, here's where a salmon
Mhm.
that needs to, like a Chinook salmon that needs to survive 3, 4, 5, 6 years at sea, has to deal with multiple pressures, things we can do stuff about, things we can't necessarily manage. Um,
Mhm.
and one pressure that's been increasing in both magnitude and attention is bycatch in high seas fisheries. And I won't say
Yeah.
it's just a recent problem. It's been a problem since the Japanese were high seas drift gill netting back in the 50s. So back in the 1950s,
This was the first crash of king
one
salmon,
of the
right?
first crashes, from the late 50s through the 80s, there was one of the worst fishing practices ever occurring in the high seas. And that was stringing these miles long monofilament drift gill nets to catch salmon, squid. They'd catch marine mammals, but they would catch Chinook salmon by the hundreds of thousands. And I'm actually just
Wow.
looking at an old report. There were periods where that catch was at least exceeding the commercial catch in Alaska. So right now you've doubled up the mortality of on salmon. Um, and during that same time, many of the whale species also had been whaled into pretty low abundance levels.
Yes.
Your orcas from the Pacific Northwest, almost half of them had been captured and sent to aquariums around the world. So that population
Oh my
had kind
god.
of been halved. Those eat a lot of salmon. Orcas and
And this was in the 50s, right? Like we're not talking about Moby Dick
no, yeah, I mean,
times.
we
Like
didn't stop. I don't think whaling didn't quite end in Alaska till late '60s, my understanding. Um, I'll check on that. But anyways, I'm just looking at the major tweaks we've done to the ecosystem. Um, so after, by the late '80s, they reined in high seas drift gill netting. Um, but then you did see the rise of the large scale commercial trawl groundfish fisheries. These were the factory trawlers um, that moved into the Bering Sea to target things like pollock and rockfish.
king.
Um, when those were first operating, they caught their share of Chinook salmon too, and it wasn't necessarily that well estimated. And by the time they got observers on the boats, they did get an idea that, oh boy, pollock fishing and trawling can be a problem for salmon bycatch.
Hey,
And once the Japanese trawlers or the foreign factory vessels were replaced by American trawlers, you didn't hear much about that bycatch anymore until the late
and this was with the Magnuson-Stevens Act, right, in the 1970s?
Magnuson-Stevens Act. Yeah, so there was um, there may have been some pretty good returns of Chinook at the time, although I don't think Chinook was that rosy. But other fisheries were doing okay, so you didn't hear about the bycatch as much until around the year 2000 or so, when the bycatch started to spike up again, and you were seeing
Mm.
peaks of 100,000 plus king salmon, Chinook salmon showing up in the bycatch records of the trawl fisheries. And this was at a time of serious declines in the Yukon River.
Wow.
So think back to what, salmon that's got to survive multiple years at sea. If you
Mhm.
start adding up this cumulative impact of, okay, well, if you escape some predation and a trawl net in year 3, you escape predation and a trawl net in year 4, you escape predation and a
Okay.
trawl net in year 5. Any one of those years, if you don't escape one of those, that salmon's not going to make it back to the river.
Mm.
And even though the pollock fleet, they come up, and some of the estimates of the amount of bycatch that occurs in the open ocean, the estimate of what that impact is on returns, um, has an appearance of a low impact, because they say, well, not all those salmon would make it back to the river. Some might be picked off at sea. Some might be, some might die. Some might be eaten by something else. Um, but you got to at least give the salmon a chance. And even the best estimates,
Yeah.
or even the worst estimates, was estimate up to like 3%, 4%, 5% impact, 2% to 5% impacts to the size of the run of the Yukon. Um, that's a pretty big difference, because the uh, take from in-river fisheries, you generally don't want a fishery mortality over like 10, 20%. You want it to leave enough fish to be able to spawn. So if you give 2% of that to the pollock fleet, you're not leaving a lot for everyone else.
Mm.
Uh, yeah,
Well, and that's 2% on the low side,
yeah,
right? Like 5 or even higher on the high side, which is, essentially where all the fish are going, right?
yeah. And you also got to back up a bit too. Like we're seeing that Chinook salmon are also, they're not as big as they used to be. When you look at some of their diets in the winter, they're eating a lot of squid. They're eating a lot of, listen to this, fish offal. They're eating pollock guts and skins and stuff that is churned up and blown back out to sea from the factory trawlers. Now, granted, these are from samples of fish that they actually um, catch, from bycatch during factory trawling. So maybe this is correlated to fish just being nearby and feeding on stuff that's coming off the trawl boats. But given the scale of some of that flow of biomass, uh, you start to change the direction of the food web a bit, and maybe that's not the healthiest or best food for them. And it might even be exacerbating this bycatch problem.
Well, I mean, that's what I was just about to interject, right? Is that so as a fisherman, I mean, we ban bait in many rivers, right? Because that's a tried and true. Like, if you're a listener or a viewer and you've never caught a fish before, what do you think to yourself? I'm going to go get some bait if I've never fished before and attract fish through scent, smell, taste, stuff like that. And so I can't help but along those lines think when you say that it's an increasing amount of the diet of these kings who end up bycaught, it's that, yeah, I mean, they probably can smell the offal and guts and discarded aspects of the pollock for miles. That's probably attracting them directly into the path of the trawl vessels.
Very good. They're chumming for chum. Well, chumming for kings in this case, but the chum bycatch is a problem too. So they're chumming for chum.
Mhm.
So, and this is kind of reflective of it's one of those wicked problems. You can't, how much can you solve or improve this type of fishing that basically drags a giant sieve that's a football field wide through the model or through the water and along the seafloor for 5 to 10 miles. Well,
It
they put holes in the net in different places and flaps and this and that for salmon to swim out of. But by and large, you're sieving through the ocean. You're trying to herd fish into the net, and it can be a pretty non-selective type of fishing. And so, yes, this bycatch of salmon, which is a lightning rod, for the public to be concerned about, because yeah, Chinook salmon. If we can't protect Chinook salmon or conserve Chinook salmon, when the rest of us are, um, what can we do? But there's just so many other species that end up with these nets too. I mean, tons of sea stars, sea anemones, crab, halibut, you name it. Whales themselves actually end up in the net often.
Yeah, I actually had a couple of guests ask me if I would do a Halibut Wars podcast follow up, so stay tuned for that. But it's but it's a problem because again, I started the Salmon Wars podcast because I'm a huge anadromous fish guy and very passionate about these fish in particular. They're one of the reasons I moved up here, and I would argue why a lot of people would move to this state, right? Like these unmatched, the last great wild, truly wild, I have to say as well, salmon run. Like not, it's more and more hatchery enhanced for the reasons that you're talking about, but you can still, if you want a chance, and this is what I said in the article that inspired this podcast that I wrote last year. Increasingly, if you want a shot at a truly wild king salmon, it's not from the Great Lakes or like some hatchery fish from Argentina or something, right? Like Alaska is the only remaining place to do that. And increasingly, you got to get that done in the next 5 years, or I'm afraid you're not even going to be here at that point.
Yeah, it's sad to think that, but you do have to. I'm trying to hold out some hope that within the biology of the fish itself, we have some resilience, and that we can, and that through some sensible conservation minded science, some good fishery science, we can help manage our way through it. Because the salmon, there are some bright spots. I guess if you call them bright spots, um, they are finding Chinook further up north in drainages and in rivers that they haven't been seen before. That's not to say that they haven't been there in the past, but perhaps if we are losing habitat in some places, we're gaining in others. I heard they've
It's
found Chinook up in the Colville River in years past, which is pretty cool. But just that, we have seen, some pretty good returns in Sacramento River, within the last like decade and a half, I think. So even that system has had some good returns. And that's like one of I think that is the farthest south wild Chinook salmon or some portion of wild Chinook salmon return. So, they are strong, like they have the ability to do it. So we just need to help them through. So what can we do? Well, I mean, when people say we have to conserve salmon, well, we have to conserve salmon. There are so many fishermen who've been tied up to the docks over the last couple years. Many fisheries have been closed for Chinook to give them a chance to rebuild and rebound. Even
yep.
even even harvests, subsistence harvests for communities way up the Yukon River, who've been doing it for thousands of years, have been asked to step back and not practice some of their traditional ways, or they are in violation of the law, which is horrible. Um, and just all the impacts that come from losing that experience of life on the river for everyone, for fishermen, for people who come to Alaska to fish, to eat fish, to enjoy fish, and for folks who live in Alaska to, just bring their kids fishing or to fish camp or put fish away for the winter.
Oh yeah,
I
I mean,
mean,
it's something I talked about with other guests is just the notion that if you live up here, especially if you live on the Yukon, like way out in the bush, you can't just go down to Fred Meyer and get like affordable, high quality protein. even here down in like the cities and stuff, like our stuff still gets barged up to Anchorage. It's not as fresh. It's not as like recently caught. So that makes an impact on the food security of the state. But I want to back up for a second to some stuff that you covered on the science side. So we talked about a couple things. Chinook are the rarest of the salmon species in Alaska. They always have been, but increasingly they're more likely to be caught in these trawl nets, right? Like they're cratering in their runs and their population and stuff. I don't think anyone can with a straight face, although I've heard some people try to defend that that's not happening, but none of them will come on this podcast to say it publicly. Um, I will say that how is it that so many of them are getting caught in the trawl nets, but not, your sockeye or your silvers and stuff? And I think it has something maybe to do with like length of life and stuff like that. But I would like to hear more about it from you.
That is a great question. So the question, and I've often wondered, so why do we have the problem with Chinook or salmon bycatch in the open ocean, these groundfish fisheries? It's generally limited to Chinook and chum. And they barely, at least in the bycatch records, you barely see any Chinook and you barely see any sockeye. Um, I don't have a great answer for that either, but
Yeah.
clearly salmon, which to a layperson all look the same, but of course we know all the subtle differences, have oriented themselves in nature to somewhat separate themselves, so they don't.
Yeah.
Pink salmon shouldn't compete that much with Chinook salmon and chum salmon, vice versa. So that's why you have separated run timings,
Yep.
separated size, some separation of diet. Um, and so whatever Chinook and chum are doing is around the same thing that what pollock are doing. So they're feeding on either similar uh, critters,
Or pollock
or
themselves.
pollock themselves. Chinook are definitely piscivorous at that size. Chum are quite piscivorous too, although they'll eat a lot of jellyfish and soft things, but they will eat a lot of fish.
You'd think they'd be pretty carnivorous with all the teeth on them
You would
things
think, but
when
they are,
when they come into the
yeah,
river.
but they are one of jellyfish are surprisingly one of their main prey often.
Yeah.
Um, Anyhow, yeah, whatever they're doing, um, pollock is actually a pretty large proportion of Chinook's diet these days. Of the size, any smaller that they could swallow. Um, so yeah, they might be keen on that because pollock also eats pollock. Because pollock
Yes.
basically is a self-regulating forage fish in the Bering Sea.
Yeah.
It's a base of the food web for a lot of stuff, and it's also heavily targeted when they get to be a slightly larger size.
Interesting.
Yeah, so they're eating the same thing, same zones. One thing we do know from this bycatch work is that the closer you get to the Yukon River in Western Alaska, the greater proportion of Western Alaska, Yukon River Chinook you'll find in the bycatch. So it makes sense to have at least um, some buffer, some distance that you shouldn't be trawling. Um, and it is, I mean, it's miles, it's hundreds of miles away or 100 miles plus away from the mouth of the Yukon. But this is the habitat the Chinook have always needed to grow
Yeah.
to maturity in. So they're feeding there, they're feeding
Well,
there.
and 100 miles sounds far until you consider that just to lay some eggs without ever eating anything, they'll swim 2,000 miles
Right,
upriver,
right.
against the currents.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
so like a little bit of perspective there on that. So, switch gears a little bit, talk a little bit about Oceana, the work you guys are doing, and like, you've alluded to a number of things, like what kinds of different policy perspectives and stuff that you think could really help these fish. So one of the things I've been asking a lot of guests is, set aside for a moment, the North Pacific Fishery Management Council, set aside legislatures and governors and all that stuff, okay? Just say somebody on the floor, the senator, what have you, owed you a favor and was going to introduce a bill with 5 policy points. crafted solely by Jon Warrenchuk with the express intent of rescuing, like fixing this salmon crisis that you've so well cited for us. What would they be and why?
Wow. Well, it's an honor to have such authority here. uh, well, there's
I can't guarantee it'll happen, but
right.
I can try.
There's not many people who you know would would assume to have all the answers. But I definitely can come up with some things I think that would help. Um,
Mhm.
One thing to help salmon through this period of change, you need to really build some resilience in the population. Um, we need to, do a good job at protecting habitat, and we've done that in Alaska. We haven't dammed up our rivers for the most. We haven't
Mhm.
dammed up our rivers. We haven't clear cut our forests. It doesn't look like BC or down south. So we're doing a fairly good job on the habitat side. We're
Mhm.
careful around aquatic systems and mines and all that. So we prioritize habitat in this state, and that's great. You know, fish come first. Um, count everything, and everything counts. So uh, if you were taking bycatch in offshore fisheries, that needs to count. And if fisheries are closed, then those fish shouldn't be taken. Uh, if you can't if you
Yes.
can't if you can't show that this is not having that ca- this that saving those fish can help in some way, then you should try to save those fish. Um,
Mhm.
you need a little better what I'd call spatial management. Does it make sense to let trawling happen in most of the habitat where salmon need to grow to maturity and feed before they return to rivers?
Yes.
There are pockets here and there of places where the federal fisheries can't trawl, but they're not necessarily designed around where the important habitat areas are for salmon or other species. And
Mhm.
you got to look at habitat from the top of the water column all the way to the seafloor, because
And
keeping that seafloor intact and productive is also a big part of this equation. Chinook salmon are pretty neat actually at the kind. They're such great predators. They can eat a lot of different things. I just saw a post on Facebook, someone who had caught a fish and looked in its stomach, which I saw all us fishermen love to do, of course. And it was
yeah.
packed with um, the larva of wolf eels, which are actually pretty big. They are large. You'd almost call them forage fish. So if you've ever seen a wolf eel, think of the type of habitat that thing lives in, crags and corals and sponges. So for that animal to be able to produce enough larvae that eventually a Chinook salmon could gorge itself on, what a neat little food web connection that, um, at least for that particular salmon, contributed to survival to eventually be caught by a fisherman. Now multiply that
Yeah.
by, 100 billion times, and that's what the ecosystem is. So the more we can maintain those type of connections, ensuring a habitat for a wolf eel is as rich as productive as the habitat for Chinook salmon, at least in some areas, will go a long way to helping this reduced, low abundance of Chinook, weather this um, um, this pinch point. So yeah, spatial management. You need some places where you can guarantee the salmon can feed and grow to maturity.
Let's address for a moment so there's a lot of astroturf organizations that are working on behalf of the trawl fleet and the industry. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. It's part of the reason why I wanted to take kind of an unbiased look at salmon is and talk to people that are not industry aligned, so that the people not just here in Alaska but across the country get a real sense of what's going on. But you see a lot of coverage in the news, and you see a lot of all the different press releases and stuff that claim that, well, none of the Chinook salmon, or very few of them, that the trawl fleet are catching are even genetically related to the salmon of the Yukon River, right? they hold that one up. They're like, oh, only 1% or 2% of the Chinook that we're catching were actually bound for the Yukon River. They're claiming that they're destined for elsewhere. Tell us a little bit about, your opinion on that. Whether you think that that's, I mean, I get the sense that that's cherry picking to a degree because I've worked in public relations long enough to know when something sounds like bullshit. But tell me your opinion on that.
Yeah, well, I don't think we can't say that the Pollock fleet is not concerned about salmon bycatch. I've been to enough meetings with these folks to know they are working hard. This is one of their major PR and management problems that they're trying to
Okay.
get ahead of and find a solution to. So they're well aware of the problem, and they've the federal government, the scientists that are helping study this have been doing a good job sampling and providing genetic estimates of where the salmon that are being caught as bycatch come from. And you do
Yeah.
see patterns of yes, there is some proportion of hatchery fish in certain areas of the Bering Sea that would have been heading back to Asia or Russia, being caught as bycatch. But the closer you get to Western Alaska, the region of what's called Cod Alley or through Unimak Pass, it's a pretty large portion of Alaska and Pacific Northwest fish.
Yeah.
Not Pacific North, not there. Western Alaska. Yeah, I guess Western Alaska and Pacific Northwest fish. Um,
Okay.
so depending where and what time of year, yes, you can have different proportions of different stocks in the bycatch, including stocks of hatchery origin in Asia. But in some regions, it can be up to 25 to 60% Western Alaska fish. So, you can't say that not having 16,000 fish return to the Yukon River this year wouldn't be good for the stock. It would certainly be good for the stock because that 16,000 Yukon River fish or 16,000 Western Alaska fish being caught, um, there is zero being allocated to be caught in river this coming year.
Well, and how many eggs does a salmon lay, right? If we assume 50% of those are female, that's 8,000 females, right? Help us understand. I'm not asking you to like stake your name on this math, right? But like to me, the simple napkin math, depending on how many eggs get laid, even if we put it at a pretty modest hatch rate, still would make an impact far above zero. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
sure. I mean, you should at least give them a chance.
Mhm.
Manage what we can, and try to mitigate what we can. These aren't large. I mean, the escapement goals for some of these systems in Western. I mean, they're not large. They're a few thousand fish, a few hundred fish sometimes. So
Mhm.
and that actually backing up to the genetic components. One thing that does concern me about this bycatch is how often uh, these lightning strikes will show up, which is kind of a code word for, oh, they caught a lot of salmon at once in one tow. And
Mm.
the genetic sampling method, um, I believe, is to take genetic samples from the first 10 fish that the observer picks out of the sample. Like it's not comprehensive. Every fish in the catch is not sampled for genetics. Um, but what that means is maybe these lightning sample catches, we're not getting a true picture of what the genetics of that lightning strike was composed of. My hypothesis, my
Mhm.
my fear is that there are these risky tows that could, wipe out entire returns or stocks. If it's all you gotta. This is a bit of science that no one really knows anything about. Do fish that travel into school at sea are they generally related? Uh, no one really knows actually, but you got to think that
Yeah.
Chinook salmon, as they're making their way back to the rivers that they're going to spawn in, at least start aggregating around the mouths, and then at some distance out to sea, got to start queuing in on the same paths. So I'm a little concerned that getting into any one of these migratory pathways or familial groups that could be a school, you could have an outsized impact.
Well, that's a great question, right? Is the notion of how do we even map these like migratory paths and stuff? Is that a viable option maybe like from a policy perspective, figuring out a way to like what would something like that cost as a study to like map migratory pathways and then put together a proposal to mitigate, I won't even use the B word, ban,
Ugh.
right? Mitigate like ground fishing
Right.
and factory fishing in these much the same way that we would treat like for any other fishery, not the trawl fishery, the halibut nursery or
Yeah.
something of that nature, right?
Right. I mean, and I don't think that's an unreasonable ask at all. What the fishery management system up here in Alaska, at least on the offshore federal waters of the Bering Sea and the Gulf, it has evolved into this beast that is prioritized for large scale, large volume offshore groundfish fishing. Um,
Right.
I don't recall anyone being asked whether that was the best use of the Bering Sea, of the rearing habitat of all of our salmon species. Um, I don't think anyone's really looked at, maybe some of the best use of at least parts of the Bering Sea should be to grow wild salmon. Doesn't that make sense?
Mm,
Um,
yeah.
and if that would take, say, reducing pollock catches by half, that's a typical swing of what a typical Alaska fisherman usually has, or commercial fisherman has to deal with. Quotas raising or decreasing by pretty large amounts from year to year. But that same variability or adaptability doesn't necessarily apply to the factory trawlers because they need high volumes, constant flow of fish to remain profitable, as do the plants in Dutch Harbor and Kodiak that need high volumes of fish moving through the plant um, to keep their markets in Asia happy.
Yeah, well, and that's really the problem, right? Like if we reduced pollock catch by 50% here domestically, would that really affect the US food system very much? Probably not. Like to be honest, because all this stuff's getting sold to China anyway, or not all of it, but
Well, quite a bit of it comes back from China to the U.S., which is ironic and long and circuitous journey for. Uh, I mean, it almost breaks my heart that you can have trawling through the seafloor habitat of halibut offshore Kodiak to catch uh, a different kind of flatfish like yellowfin sole or arrowtooth flounder, um, and that it is sent to China and then it is sent back to Walmart, available at the Kodiak to be bought in a frozen as a frozen fillet in a plastic bag.
all right. So I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but I've got just a couple more questions if you'll indulge me.
What we would do to the magic wand that would save salmon? Yeah,
Yeah,
well, count everything, make everything count. You know, protect the habitat, and that includes the seafloor habitat that provides the structure for food web and all these little beasties that Chinook and other fish eat and hide in. Um, Let me back up. And when I talk about count everything and everything counts, you need um, observers on boats that are taking large amounts of salmon at these trawl boats that are taking large amounts of salmon at sea. And we still have in the Gulf of Alaska trawling occurring without any oversight, monitoring, or estimate of how much bycatch occurs on some of those boats. This year, they're predicting some of the highest observer coverage in a long time, in that 40% of the trips of the trawl fleet in the Gulf are going to be or were observed, which means 60% of the trips with trawling were not observed. And so, what was going on during those trips?
right. Well, okay, so there's this notion in the North American model of wildlife conservation, which don't get me started on the fact that these high seas fisheries are managed by the Commerce Department, not Fish and Wildlife or scientists, right? Because that has been an overarching theme of my career as an activist for hunting and wildlife and stuff is the notion that scientists at the state level, scientists at the federal level, scientists should be putting together these policies, not bureaucrats or especially not business people whose entire livelihood is dependent on keeping the fisheries open and flowing. But there's this notion that if it pays, it stays, right? We use it to talk about everything from wildlife harvest and hunting in Africa to, or an argument in favor of the North American model is just that like fishermen and hunters and stuff are who pay for conservation, and by creating this value to these communities, that's why these species continue to exist. So the fear that I have is that it's kind of it's a spiral that I think we're in at the moment where pollock are tremendously valuable from a monetary standpoint just by volume alone, not for the 6 cents a pound or whatever it is that they're getting for the flesh, but they're tremendously valuable economically. And so that fishery, because it pays, will stay, right? Landing tax, all that stuff. My question is, how do we make Chinook salmon, who are already tremendously valuable to the, or not anymore because we can't fish for them anymore, but tremendously valuable to the tourism and sport fishing industries in the state, but also tremendously valuable when available to be caught by commercial fishermen as well, because they're really high quality food that goes for, in the grocery stores between $30 and $50 a pound. So like, how do we bridge the gap between the economic engine that is pollock fishing and making it a more equitable distribution between, hey, pollock fisheries are tremendously valuable, but salmon fisheries are not just economically valuable, which they are, and won't be if we keep destroying them, right? But also tremendously ecologically valuable. You know what I mean? Like, how do we, if you've ever given it some thought, now's the time, right? Like, how do we bridge that gap for people?
Right. Uh, uh, boy, fishing is one of those funny things that you will keep doing, and even commercially. Uh, and there have been studies who've seen this. Commercial fishermen will sometimes keep at it even when it's not economically feasible, and it's part of
Mm.
the lifestyle and part of the culture. And there's just enough ups to make up for the downs often. And that's fine. And that's when I'm talking about smaller, smaller boat fishermen. Um,
Yeah.
and so in some respects, this is a period of weathering it through for Chinook, at least, that we're in a low point, and maybe the high point in the future is going to make up for it. And but on a purely monetary, it's harder to balance it if you just balance it on, say, value of the food flesh or value of the fish itself. Um, I
Mhm.
think the existence, I mean, that's a corny term to use, the existence value. Just knowing there are big fish out there to be caught, I think gets people excited. um,
Okay.
but you're right. We have to take a step back and make, maybe a little bit broader interpretation of valuation, of valuation, monetary valuation. In fact, it wasn't until fairly recently the Department of Commerce barely considered sport fishing to be part of their, you only see reports in the last few years about how valuable and important sport fishing is as part of the economy of, ocean management and fisheries management. So it's not
Mhm.
about just all catching fish for food. It's about everything else associated with going out on the water for a day. I mean, it's a huge economic engine. Boy, could you take into account the societal, medical, costs of not having opportunities to fish in the communities up the rivers? Well, that is probably multi millions, tens of millions of dollars. If you look at downstream effects of, like, oh, depression and
Poor nutrition,
nutrition
even.
and family, uh, stuff going on in families, and the loss of culture and relationships, all that can happen just from not spending a summer salmon season together. So we got to start adding up those costs and really weighing them against, uh, not just the value of, say, the pollock fishery, but um, even using changing management of these offshore fisheries as part of an experiment to perhaps address or build resiliency on some of those other impacts. because right now the disparity in the fairness of this um, is one sided. I mean, you got large numbers of users being asked to conserve a resource while another user of this resource is doing what they can, but not to the same level that all these other users are asked to conserve.
John, any other? So we touched a lot about bycatch. I just want to give you an opportunity, just so if for no other reason than so that people don't think that I'm just pushing you along this bycatch thing. Any other things that you think are kind of human led that are contributing to the impacts on salmon, the crisis as you called it, or any other factors that people should be really aware of? You want to touch on any of those quickly?
Oh yeah, gee, there is a worry. Have you heard of ichthyophonus? There is a disease that they've found in the wild salmon in the Yukon River. It seems to be like a parasitic degenerative disease that likely has some fitness effects. I mean, you see lesions in the flesh. Um, I worry about how that has spread into the fish. Has this spread through, for example, eating fish offal off of being discarded at sea? It's you
Man,
don't one of the things we know very, very little about is things like marine viruses and the parasites and protozoans in the ocean. Um,
man,
and in nature, you don't take a metric ton of different species and cram them all together. But that's exactly what
no,
trawl nets do. A lot of different things coming in contact with each other, eating things they wouldn't normally eat, just rubbing all over the place. Uh, what are we doing to help spread these diseases? Um,
man,
uh, Fish hatcheries, fish farming, that's definitely use of antibiotics in places where there is fish farming is a great risk for spread into wild populations. Our friends in Canada to the south have kind of written off wild stocks in favor of fish farms. Sad to see. Um, so we do have a lot of
that really is
it's
heartbreaking,
it
by
is
the way, to see.
heartbreaking, and it's something to keep them on top of and aware of in Alaska because believe me, the Department of Commerce has their eyes on Alaska for aquaculture.
All right, John. Just last thing. Any upcoming projects, initiatives, things of that nature, or really just key messages that you hope listeners are going to take from this. I mean, and I'm talking from Missouri to Montana, from New Jersey to Alaska. We've got listeners all over the country right now that are just listening to the trailers as they drop, following along with this story. We're really hitting a massive audience. What do you say to those people who are like asking, like, okay, you've given us all this science. What can I do as like some rando guy, who just likes to fish or who maybe I'm sitting in the Ozarks fishing for bass and thinking to myself someday if I stow away a couple $1,000 I can run up to Alaska and catch a salmon. What do you say to those people?
Well, come on up. I mean, the more the merrier. Well, not the more the merrier, but Alaskans, as much as we have our love slash hate relationship with tourism. Alaskans do love showing people around and the sparkle in someone's eye when they catch a fish. I mean, that's just I really dig it when someone sees a whale for the first time or catches a fish for the first time, or even if they've been to Alaska a whole bunch of times. That spectacle of nature, I think, is something to cherish. Um, and Alaska, is the last stronghold of that spectacle and the last stronghold of salmon. Um, and so, I mean, I'm not saying, don't eat salmon. Wild salmon is a great source of protein, and that is something you can do as a consumer. Any kind of fish or seafood that you buy or eat in a store or order at a restaurant, ask where it's from. Demand um, sustainable, wild caught, non-trawl, and there are lists out there of what's good, what's bad. But ask, get to know your fish, get to know where it comes from, get to know the impacts behind it. Um, if you have a choice whether or not to buy pollock and that concerns you, just know that fishery catches Chinook salmon when fisheries up and down the coast are closed. They're not allowed to catch Chinook salmon. So market pressure can
It,
help. But yeah,
it,
being informed on the type of products you buy, um, helping money flow to these economies, and even if the quota is slightly down, cherishing being able to catch those 1 or 2 or 4 fish that you get to bring back, um, and asking a lot of questions. I think it's good to ask questions and ask your politicians to be involved and do something for these fisheries, because everyone in this country benefits from healthy fisheries, I think, and healthy opportunities.
Absolutely. And on that note, Jon, incredible conversation. Thank you so much for joining the Salmon Wars podcast. I really think, especially for the listeners, you got a lot out of that. Listen to the next couple episodes. You'll get the perspectives of the people on the ground, tackle shops, restaurants in the state of Alaska, sport fishing guides, commercial fishing people, both inside and out of trawl, who've worked in the industry, who understand what's happening. Talking to news reporters who've covered this for 30 years. We're getting all these perspectives, putting them together for you so that you can make an educated and informed decision about this crisis, as Jon just showed us, that is affecting these iconic fish in the Pacific Northwest. Jon, thank you so much. Thank you to Oceana for allowing you to be on here. This was tremendously helpful and educational for me, which was part of the reason why I wanted to do the show. So,
Hey, thanks, Cody.
this is Salmon Wars.